I'm not shushing. I'm
They're
laughing.
laughing at me. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Dynasty Rankings YouTube channel. I'm your host, Michael Bauer, joined today by Zack Duarte. Zack, for whatever reason, thinks that I'm avoiding him, but I'm not. But there
Yeah.
are, however, dynasty mistakes that I'm trying to avoid, Zack's trying to avoid, and we want to tell you what they are and why we want to avoid them. Most importantly, Zack, we're going to tell you what to do about it. Let's start it off. What is the first mistake that you want to avoid as a dynasty player?
As a dynasty player, Mike, I'd really like to avoid underestimating trade values. And this can work in a couple different ways. You can overestimate the value of your players or underestimating the value of your own players, but also underestimating the value of your league mates' players, right? Sometimes that can rub people the wrong way. And we all have like one or two people, whether it's in every league or whether it's in just all your leagues combined, where there's just one person that sends you an offer and you just roll your eyes, right? You're just, here we go again. Like, what is this going to be, right? And you don't want to be that person. But really, what I want to focus on here is undervaluing your own players in trades. The way that you can kind of work on this, Mike, is just using the resources that we have at hand. No one likes to say they like trade calculators except for me. Like, I love trade calculators. And again, it's not something you have to show your opponent, but it's something that can help you one way or the other when you receive an offer or you're trying to send. And look, the trade calculators are not the end all be all. They're not a Bible. They are
It's
more of like guidelines, right? I use the trade calculator, and we like to use DLF here on this channel.
Mhm.
Or you could use Keep Trade Cut, although I'm not in as much in favor as crowdsourced information as much as I am analytics driven information, and that's what DLF is. I plug that trade into the calculator, and if it's close, then I start to formulate an offer based on how that calculator reacts. Again, not the end all be all, but more of a resource. You can use rankings. You can use, there's different websites that have rankings. We have our own rankings here at the Dynasty Rewind. We talk about this a lot, Mike, on this channel. We have a community ourselves. You referenced it already by joining the Patreon. You can get that 7-day free trial. But our Discord and other Discords are very active when it comes to asking trades. Like, there are certain situations, Mike, where I am unsure of a trade and I
Yeah.
ask our patrons, but I'll ask Bob, I'll ask other people individually
You
about certain
can
trades. So just
pick
engaging your community, really. But most importantly, before I ever send out a trade, Mike, and I'll let you go after this, I always ask myself this one question: would I accept this trade if I was on the receiving end of it?
a lot of time, and a lot of people, their strategy with trading is they don't always want to send out their best offer first. And I get that. But I do feel that it is your duty as a league mate and our duty as fantasy analysts, if you want to call us that, we should send out an acceptable trade. You know what I mean? Like, it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be your best offer, but it has to be enough to make somebody go, I think I kind of like that. I think I could work with that. So, Zach, this is great. Underestimating trade values. I'm coming around on the calculators a little bit. All right, let's talk about my mistake, Zach, that I want to avoid, and that's overvaluing rookie picks. This is something that, every time I formulate a trade, you're talking about values, and that's understandable. I feel like every time I would put a trade together, the only compensation I would ever ask for back is draft picks. But what does that really do for you, Zach? Because if all you have is all these draft picks, but there's nothing else to start to build on, what really does that do for your team? Not every rookie class is going to be the savior for your team. You're going to have holes at the end of every season for the most part, unless you build a real juggernaut because you're a rewinder. But that's not always going to happen. You're not always going to get the guys that you want to get in the rookie draft. It doesn't work that way. So the fix for that is when I'm putting together trades, I don't just always look at draft picks as my entire compensation. Zach, if you and I are making a trade, I'm going to look at my roster first completely. Starting lineup, bench, taxi, IR, everything I have. And I'm going to do the same thing with your team as well. Who do you have on IR that maybe you forgot about because you're busy making waiver claims, setting your lineup? Who's on your taxi squad that, again, you might have forgotten about because you're busy just managing your roster in season? Let's not forget, we get busy, we get focused on the right now, winning games right now. I know it's a dynasty team, but it's still redrafting your mind a little bit when you're in season. So I want to see, do you have any good up and coming players? Do you have an abundance of players at a certain position that might help me? Like maybe Zach has a ton of really good wide receivers on his team, and it's like, oh, I'll just draft a guy. But what if I don't have any first or second round picks? I'm trying to get some back, but I can't do it. But maybe I could swing a deal with Zach and get a good wide receiver back. You get a guy back that I think could be a productive wide receiver in the future. So draft picks are great. That's fine. The hit rate's not always there. Sometimes it's better to just get a guy that's in the NFL that's productive right now.
Yeah, I had a trade this week that I couldn't ultimately pull off, but it's actually with one of our patrons, Coop, in one of our leagues,
Mhm.
and he has a juggernaut team, and I have a rebuilding team. I have enough draft picks for the next year, and I think he sustained injuries to Kirk Cousins and then Joe Burrow. So we were
It's
talking
tough.
about a trade for Baker Mayfield. The way that we started off this trade was basically saying, I don't need any more draft capital. I have enough. If I'm going to make a trade, if I'm going to move Baker, who might not be a quarterback one, but is a pretty good quarterback two. I've always liked Baker.
Startable right into his lineup.
Right.
Good to go.
And look, I know where this is going to lead in the comment section, but he had just a bevy of wide receivers. CD Lamb, Jamar Chase. Like he's loaded in this league. And I'm like, I'd like to get Garrett Wilson. We could figure out a package. I could even send you some picks, but I'm not always trying to trade for draft picks because, like you just said, we don't want to overvalue them. Like sometimes we need some substance in the trade to build around, and doing it by only having rookie picks, which I'm going to get to here with my next point, is a huge mistake because sometimes, Mike, we focus too much on future potential, and that's one of my mistakes to avoid.
Completely agree.
Rebuilding, yeah, look, rebuilding and building with youth is fun, but Mike, so is winning. No one has ever won a championship in Dynasty Fantasy Football with players on rookie only contracts. I see so many roster reviews where there's just no meat on the bone to some of these rosters. And yes, there is a lot of draft capital, but sometimes I'm like, why don't we use some of this draft capital to buy some players? Because banking on rookies is a pretty bad way to go. It's
Yeah.
not fun. Like I like to draft rookies, but not only rookies. And this is something that I'll focus on a little bit later, right? Make sure to fill the gaps on your roster with veteran players that are scoring points. They are very affordable in the offseason, and that's upcoming this January through the rookie draft season. Players are dead in terms of value. You can get so many good deals.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to buy players, and it's definitely an area where you can address your team and help your team move from that rebuilding to that contending phase. A couple of examples of this last year were Mike Evans and David Montgomery. Who was buying Mike Evans last year after Tom Brady retired? Who was
Nope.
buying David Montgomery after he left Chicago and went to Detroit, where there was still DeAndre Swift and there was still talk about them drafting another running back? So look for that time period to buy some players if you're trying to address your team. Don't be afraid to do it during the season. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but focusing too much on future potential is a way to get caught in the web of dynasty and kind of just stay in the middle. So make sure that like Mike said, don't overvalue rookie picks. And I'll talk about later, making sure that you don't have any rookie picks so that you can make trades later on in the season. It's kind of a fine mix of the 2 points there.
That also with overvaluing rookie picks still also kind of ties into my next point as well. And that's, you do have to be patient with rookies. We get frustrated. I get it. You draft a guy highly. We're all still waiting for Jameson Williams to be a thing. He was a first round rookie draft pick in a lot of cases, but these guys take time to develop. I know a lot of these guys played in the SEC, and yes, that's as close to the NFL as you can get from a college football perspective, but going from college to the NFL is still a really, really big leap. So you got to be patient with these guys. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do, Zach? You just going to move on right away? How does that help you? Now, there are certain circumstances where you could see a guy's just not going to pan out. Like if he's traded after his rookie year, Trent Richardson, Kadarius Toney, these guys probably aren't going to make it unless you have a rookie that's a locked in starter. Like Anthony Richardson's a really good example. You should really have these guys on your bench, on your taxi squad. You should not be throwing them in the lineup from the get go. Again, unless you have a good pulse on the team. And feel free to ask guys who are fans of the teams that your player plays on. Like I could ask Zach, hey, Devon Achan, how's he looking in camp? What are you hearing? I would ask Bob all the time, what are you hearing about Luke Musgrave and Jaden Reed? Feel free to ask people that are fans of those teams, like, hey, what are you hearing? Because I live in Eastern Pennsylvania. I'm not going to hear the same stuff that Zach's going to hear in South Florida. Bob's going to hear in Wisconsin. Sean's going to hear different things up in New England that I'm not going to hear about Patriots players. So, it is regional, even though Dynasty is nationwide, engage with people, but you have to be a little patient too. Don't take less value on these players just because they get a little banged up or they're not playing the way that you want him to. Like, don't trade Anthony Richardson away cheap just because he got hurt. You know what I mean? Be
Yeah.
patient, chill with these guys. Zach, what is the next mistake that you're trying to avoid?
Well, this is something if you've seen my videos, I talk about in almost every opportunity I get. And I know that injuries are devastating, right? But there should always be a reaction to an injury, no matter what your position is in your leagues. Couple different ways, and this is a very multifaceted point. A couple different ways we could use injuries to our advantage. Injury value dips are real. I love buying injured players because it is an opportunity to buy a player at a price you typically would not be able to. These are typically longer term injuries. Like trying to buy Joe Burrow right now, you're not really going to get much of a value dip. I've been trying in a couple places and it hasn't really happened. And I'm trying to sell it as I'm eating this injury for you. It's not really happening. But when you get a long term injury, when you get that dialogue like Anthony Richardson right now, oh, his shoulder problems. Oh, he's always injured. You might be able to buy Anthony Richardson lower now that he's hurt as opposed to when he was thriving in weeks 3 and weeks 4. Another way, stashing players that are one injury away from being a focal point in any offense. I think a good one I can bring up right now is Chris Rodriguez, right? Not a fantasy relevant player at all, but Antonio Gibson was just out for this week. What happens if there's an injury to Brian Robinson? All of a sudden,
I
Chris
like that.
Rodriguez is your RB1. I'm going to separate this in a couple different ways now for contenders and rebuilders. If you're a contender, move injuries to rebuilding teams for talent that can help you win. If you sustain the Mark Andrews injury, can you get another? Can you get a TJ Hawkinson from another owner? Can you make it so that you don't lose games because now you don't have another fantasy relevant tight end? And if you're a rebuilding team, you should be on the opposite end of that. Engage owners that just sustained the devastating injury to see if you have something that they may need, most likely for draft capital. But like we mentioned earlier, try to get some players too. The example I talked about earlier, where I was trying to move Baker Mayfield to the owner of Joe Burrow and Kirk Cousins, is a situation where it doesn't benefit me right now, but it might benefit me in the long term to move Baker Mayfield, get some assets, maybe a player I can build my roster around. I know Baker Mayfield for Garrett Wilson is nuts. I was trying to offer a package. Calm down. But also just help that owner replace that injury hit that they just took. There are a lot of teams that are in the thick of playoff races right now. They just lost Mark Andrews. They just lost Joe Burrow. There's some other devastating injuries. We don't know as of recording this what happened to Cooper Kupp. There are Kenneth Walker. There are Devon Achan. There are a lot of injuries that happened right after we're recording this on Sunday that could potentially have devastating impacts in your league. And for you not to be front and present in those inboxes or buying those players, it's a way to get behind the 8 ball in Dynasty. It's the way that I really turn my rebuilds into contenders by buying injury dips. Trust me, I have a lot more Kirk Cousins right now than I did a month ago.
I'm not going to disagree with you. I will say I just think it's harder to buy a player like Joe Burrow or Anthony Richardson. One, because they're quarterbacks, quarterbacks are the premium. Two, we know Joe Burrow is going to be a Bengal next year. We know Anthony Richardson will be the quarterback of the Indianapolis Colts. We don't know where Kirk Cousins is going to be next year. But I think two players that you could probably buy lower on now, one really low, J.K. Dobbins. You could buy him super cheap. Talk about buying an injury discount. I think he's somewhere next year, and I think he's going to be a good RB3 flex play on your team. I don't think he's going to be what we ever thought he was going to be coming out of Ohio State. And Nick Chubb, 27, 28 years old. I think he'll be 28 when the season starts next year, coming off a knee injury. He's a guy I would look to buy as well. I just think the running back position might be a little bit easier to buy coming off an injury than quarterback. Love where your head is at, though, and I love that strategy. That's all I wanted to add to that. And now, Zach, I'm going to tell you something that I personally have been extremely guilty of. And I've preached all the time that they matter, and they do. However, I tend to overvalue late round draft picks way too much. Guilty. I'm going to stop doing it. And I think part of my problem was I just love the value back there, but then I expected too much out of these guys. And that's on me. They can be valuable, but not all late rounders become fantasy contributors. I was looking at some of my leagues that I'm in, some of the drafts. And like I said, I do still think that they have importance, but I do need to preface that they're good add-ins on trades. Okay, it's draft capital. It's ammunition for the trade. And it's great to take flyers in the draft. Some of these guys have panned out. There's guys like Terry McLaurin was a really good late round draft pick when he came out. And look at this last year: Puka Nakua, Aiden O'Connell, Tank Dell. These guys are all contributors right now. Puka and Tank, especially Aiden O'Connell, could have possibly saved some seasons here if you had him sitting on your taxi squad somewhere. But look, there's 3 players out of 2 rounds of drafting. That's 24 picks. You're getting 3. So you see the hit rate here, Zach, and the possibility is if Cooper Kupp didn't get hurt to start the season, is Puka Nacua a thing? So we see that there's outliers here. We see it takes a lot for these late round guys to be relevant. So you need to make sure that when you're looking forward to your next draft, you have a good mix, but recognize that if you want to be competitive, the better players, they're typically at the beginning of the draft, about 99.8% of the time.
No, this is a tough one, man. Because I actually really like having late round picks. I will agree with you when you say don't overvalue late round picks, but late round picks to me do have value. And I've talked about this before. I might be better at drafting late than I am at drafting early. Like I have a lot of shares of Kendra Miller this year. But then I have a lot of shares of Puka Nakua, Jaden Reed, Michael Wilson, all guys that I got in rounds 2, 3, 4.
What do you
So
consider? I'm just curious,
yeah,
like, where do you consider the cutoff from going an early to a late round pick? I put it like right at the 3,
yes.
midway through the 3rd round.
I do third round, and then one quarterback league, I do like 206 to 208.
Okay. All right.
Because you're talking about in one quarterback leagues, 18 rookies being relevant.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. So in Superflex with quarterbacks, we can get to 2022. Once we get to, I consider third round players for the most part like dart throw guys, for the most part.
Yeah. The hit rate's not always there, but you could still find some gems.
Yeah.
And Chris Rodriguez, like you were talking about before, another late round guy as well.
Yeah.
And like you said, he's one bad hit away on Brian Robinson, who Brian Robinson runs hard, man. Good
No,
for
no
him.
doubt. No doubt. To counteract your point, just devaluing draft capital in general to me is a big dynasty mistake. And we all have this one or two owner in every single league that just doesn't have any draft picks for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And then it comes to this part in the season where they sustain an injury and they're looking for a player and they're adding everybody in the league chat. Oh, need a running back. And you hit the trade button and you look at their roster and you're like, dude, you have no draft capital. What am I trading for? I had this instance where there was an owner in a league who was like, oh, I need a wide receiver. So I hit him up. I'm like, hey, listen, you have no draft capital. This was a couple weeks ago when Bijan like missed the game or like he started the game but never played. Then the next week he like didn't get any goal line, whatever the situation was the last few weeks. I'm like, hey, how about I trade for Bijan Robinson? Like, let's figure something out because you have no draft capital. Otherwise, what do you expect me to trade for? You expect me to trade for your veteran players? No, I'm obviously going to ask for young rookies that I'm going to build around. So again, it's fine to use draft capital in trades for proven talent, but to not have a cachet of picks throughout the season is a huge mistake. It's such an important thing to have a few draft picks if you need throughout the season to get some kind of a trade done. Listen, even on teams where I've dealt my first and second round picks in our Rewinders versus Patrons League, I've dealt my first and second round picks, but I have like 3, 4, 5 third and fourth round picks each. What's the worst that can happen? The way that I really remedy this on situations where I'm moving my first and seconds, I just ask. I ask for draft picks. I'll ask for a third. I'll take a fourth. I'll ask for a fourth. I'll take a fifth. Make sure to have picks available for trades in the second half of competitive seasons to buy players. There are injuries that are going to happen. We haven't even gotten to weeks 13 and 14. There's I think there's 4 or 6 teams on a bye week 13. There's 2 teams on a bye week 14. You're going to have to fill some of these holes, and that's not injuries, that's just bye week. So to not have movable assets in draft capital to make these moves during the season is a huge mistake. I see it so often, and I think it's a very redraft mentality, and we've got to kind of embrace this dynasty aspect of it, where we may not be drafting rookie players in the rookie draft, but we need to have these picks to make trades.
That kind of rolls into my next point too. Big mistake, neglecting depth. Depth is one of the most important things that you could have on your dynasty roster, but roster depth is crucial. And neglecting it leaves your team vulnerable to injuries or underperformance. And the thing is, bye weeks happen. Zach just said it. Injuries happen all the time. Make the small trades, Zach. Make the small trades that people don't want to make. There were players that you could have acquired cheaply before the season. Guys like Adam Thielen. Nobody wanted to touch that guy. He's top 10 wide receiver a couple weeks ago. Jake Ferguson, Brian Robinson could have been had cheaply. Guys like this that you can get cheaply. It doesn't have to be sexy. It just has to be productive. They would have been great to slide in your starting lineup to cover injuries and buys. In some cases, you make these trades, they outperform your projected starters. I don't care who's in my starting lineup. I care who's getting me the most points. There's a lot of circumstances where Miles Sanders was supposed to be a focal point of my team. I understand that the Carolina Panthers are not a good franchise. Sanders hasn't looked good when he's on the field. I'm putting, Brian Robinson was going to be my backup to Miles Sanders. Brian Robinson's been elevated. I started in certain spots today. I hope I don't regret it, but I saw the Steelers lost. I started Devin Singletary over Najee Harris. These are the moves that you have to make sometimes. You have to make the ugly calls, and having depth is good. I'm not bragging here. There's a lot of times where I had a lot of injuries, a lot of bye weeks. I was able to pull guys off of my bench that are better than what I find on the waiver wire.
We could take this a step further. There are other players, and I think one of the lessons I've learned from this year is the depth at running back, how important it is because of how difficult it is to buy a running back at this time of the year.
RB all the way.
Right, but to have depth at it, and I mean guys like, let's look at Donta Foreman, let's look at Gus Edwards, let's look at Keaton Mitchell, let's look at Jerome Ford, let's look at Chuba Hubbard. All these guys, not very expensive prior to the season. Try and buy them now. Try and buy those guys now.
Kyren Williams,
another great example. So I think one thing I definitely will be tinkering with my approach next year is rostering backup running backs, because I had a few here and there, but it wasn't a focus of mine, and they have been so important this season. They have been, when those guys get elevated and get that opportunity, it becomes virtually impossible to try and buy some of those players, Mike. So I really like this point. I really agree with it.
No one's out of it yet, Zach, or are they? You tell us another mistake that you want to avoid.
Staying out of it when your team is out of it. I think it's such a big mistake, right? You're 1-9, you're 2-8. You kind of put the league on the back burner till the offseason. You're not really worried about this. Well, big mistake. Big mistake, because first of all, most leagues should operate with max reverse PF as your draft order, right? That's the case. You should be keeping tabs on that every week. That is the most important point I can make here, right? You want to understand where you fit in terms of the draft order. Mike will tell you why in just a second, but you want to know where you fit in that draft order, because right now, the more important draft picks are 1, 2, and 3. And if you don't have in the super flex, if you don't have a top 3 pick, it's a pretty big drop off as of right now. So where do you fit in that scheme? If you just sit there and let your team wither away and not pay attention to it, you could have guys on the taxi squad on the bench scoring points right now that you didn't really think were scoring points. So pay attention to your league. On the flip side, you need to be active on the waiver wire. You need to be active on the trade market. I talked about this in one of my videos, and the analogy we came up with is you being the pharmacy to other teams' ails, right?
Yeah.
Other teams get injuries. They need to know who to go to make a move. Do you have that Donta Foreman? Do you have that Jerome Ford that can help these teams out? And just playing the waiver wire every single week. And obviously, you're not trying to win games, but you're trying to get an asset that you can flip. Maybe you can turn a late 3 into an early 3, early 3 into a late second, whatever it is. Sometimes I just buy players and and just try and get more fab so I can keep doing this process throughout the season. You know what I mean? Being inactive in a league, while I really don't like people who do that, it is such a way again for teams to get stuck in the middle because they're not taking advantage of these little things. What we're talking about here, Mike, at the end of the day, are little things that add up when compounded. And being inactive and not making trades that can benefit you in the long term when they don't really help, when these players don't really help you right now, again, another way to stay stuck in the middle of your dynasty leagues.
I like this. I do think that the worst teams in the league should be the most active. You should also, every time you make a trade, when you pick someone up off waivers, you want to flip them, always ask for fab back, like Zach says. And I did see something on Twitter the other day. Now that the trade deadline is right around the corner, someone said that the only thing that trade deadlines hurt is the bad teams in the league. And I'd never really thought of it that way, but it makes sense. It really does if you think about it, because those are the teams that need the most help. Let them sell off to contenders and get a ransom for these guys in the playoffs. Let it happen. When they're preparing for their next rookie draft, I think what they should do is make sure that they know the future draft class strength. You also need to know that it changes. Here's why. A couple years ago, we heard the tight end class, not very good. Trey McBride, no one else. Got some good guys out of there. We've been told that this year coming up is a running back class. I got bad news for you. If you think that you need a running back and your savior's here, you're always gonna get your top heavy running backs, your top one or two. You get that with every class. But the class as a whole I think it's gonna end up being a bunch of Brian Robinsons. Not that there's anything wrong with that. They're gonna be mid-round draft picks that you hope something good happens to. Because remember, Brian Robinson was not drafted to be the starting running back of the Washington Commanders. It was supposed to be Antonio Gibson. So you have to know the strength, and that can influence your trading decisions. Got to get your eyes on these players too. Again, 7-day free trial with our Patreon. You like what you see? We got a lot of good college stuff in there. But in all sincerity, line up your rosters with next year's draft class. See what the strong points are. Now, I think this is going to be a really good quarterback draft class. To be honest with you, it's shaping up to be that way. You need a quarterback? Good news for you. You need a quarterback and your team sucks? I got good news for you. You need a really good wide receiver and your team sucks? Guess what? There's going to be a lot of good ones. You need running backs? Not so much. You need tight ends? They're good, but don't forget, tight ends take a while to develop. Fix for this too. Look to trade for a guy who has yet to bloom, like Roshan Johnson. Spend up and pay for a player who's established but coming off an injury. Talked about Nick Chubb before. Guys like that. Know the strengths of the draft class. Start watching more college football.
This last point, something I talk about a lot in roster reviews, and like you said, we have in that patron Discord that we have a channel just for the 2024 draft. So great way to get a lot of the information that you're looking out for, because I haven't done a whole lot of scouting myself, but I feel like I know a lot about the class because I'm engaged in that channel. So love this point. Definitely something I harp on a lot, and I'm very mad you stole it from me.